you evolve. And my latest evolution has led me towards flood and flood risk assessments, which is something very close to my heart because hailing from Germany, I have seen a very profound transition that the Germans and the European Union has undergone in the last, say, 5 years, where they have abandoned the traditional hazard-based flood assessments and have moved on to a purely risk-based approach. And my presentation will elaborate on those differences. So we think of floods and are starkly reminded just by the recent events in Japan. They do occur. We very quickly forget about them. Our human memories fail us. We do remember the good things and don't remember the bad things very much. The pictures in Japan, however, remind us very drastically and dramatically that these extreme floods, these extraordinary events with return periods of hundreds or thousands of years do occur and strike even developed countries. Japan is one of the countries of the world, perhaps the country in the world with the most sophisticated geohazard and risk management systems. They have their own ministry on debris flows called Sabo Works. They spend hundreds of millions of dollars every year in geohazards mitigation. Why? Because they're on the Pacific Rim. They suffer earthquakes, as you have seen, volcanic eruptions, liquefaction, landslides. They have quaternary volcanoes that blow up due to earthquakes or not. And they develop numerical models for flood assessments, even for tsunami assessments. Yet they are not immune to disaster. This picture that you just saw was the 1894 flood on Fraser River, and it had flooded very large areas, including Chilliwack, Mill Street in Chilliwack. Downtown Chilliwack was underwater. That was when Chilliwack was very small. The picture behind me there is the 1948 flood, which is the second flood on record on Fraser River. This 1948 flood had a return period of approximately 200 years. The 1894 flood had a return period of approximately 500 years. Return period means it happens on average every 500 years. But you can imagine that there were actually some people that lived through the 1894 flood and the 1948 flood. You can calculate the probability of that occurring in one's lifetime, say if somebody turns out to get 80 years old. And the probability is 3%. So two dramatic events happen in one lifetime. Quite interesting, I find. So this picture there shows you Sumas Mountain, far in the background, the top of the picture, Mount Baker on the US side of things, and an extensively flooded Fraser River floodplain. This event cost a lot of money, even though it was only in 1948 where the development and the number of people that lived on the floodplains was a fraction of what it is now. Nowadays, approximately 350,000 people live on the Fraser River floodplain, and there is, of course, vital infrastructure going through it. So, in Canada, the traditional approach is to estimate the return period of the 200-year or the flood stage of the 200-year return period event. So 200-year return period event means there's a 0.5% chance of it occurring annually. So once again, it's not that it happens every 200 years, and if it happens today, it won't happen for another 199 years. That is not the case. There is an annual chance of it occurring. Then on one river that I know of, that is the Fraser River, the flood of record was used rather than the 200-year flood in order to design its flood protection system. And that's the 1894 flood on Fraser River. Then typically a standard freeboard is added. That's typically 2 feet or 0.6 meters. And that accounts for the uncertainty in determining the flood stage, in determining the riverine conditions. For example, gravel bed aggradation, meaning the build-up of gravel at the bottom of the river. And that can be integrated in flood hazard and risk assessments. Now, there's a whole bunch of things that have happened in Canada. Some of them are rather lamentable. So in the 1990s, the Environment Canada withdraws the support from the Federal Flood Disaster Relief Program. Not a good thing. In 2003 and 2004, the provincial land use decision process shifts away, centralized from the provincial government and onto the municipalities. There was political thoughts behind this, but it turns out to be problematic. Ministry of Transportation's approving officials make the decisions on whether new subdivisions can be approved. That has to relate to landslides or for soil-related issues and for flooding. Ministry of Agriculture and Lands decides on disposition of public lands, and so on and so forth. A number of interesting political decisions. So what created this political decision-making framework? Well, first of all, we have a rather fragmented institutional condition, whereby, for example, agricultural drainage and reservoirs are allowed without adequate regard for flooding. We have no requirements to integrate structural and non-structural adjustments. So what do I mean with structural and non-structural? Well, a dike, for example, is a structural mitigation, flood mitigation measure. A non-structural one would, for example, be zoning, in which you sterilize areas in which you cannot develop, or you designate areas where you need to account for flooding, either through elevation, which would be structural, or through non-habitation of parts of the building. There is no requirement for risk assessment. So just to make it very, very clear, there is a profound difference between hazard and risk. The risk takes into account the consequences of a hazard. The hazard assessment does not. So if you calculate the stage of a 200-year flood and you say, well, that's 351 meters as an example, that's a hazard assessment. If you say, if this flood were to occur, what would happen in terms of economic losses, ecological losses, and therefore environmental losses, perhaps loss of life or injuries, and non-tangibles such as human suffering. If you start looking at those consequences, and by looking at it I mean quantifying them, then you're in the realm of a risk assessment. Very, very different things. So what that has led to is a false sense of safety or security amongst humans who think there is a dike, I live in the developed world, nothing can happen to me. Well, you've just seen in Japan what all that knowledge that the Japanese have pooled has helped them. Of course, we didn't see the 300,000 people that died as in the Haiti earthquake, where there is no building codes and buildings just crumbled all over the place. We didn't see it in Japan, but we did see thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of people dying in a tsunami, even though they have the world's most sophisticated tsunami warning system. Flood recovery efforts do not support reduction of future flood losses. That's very important. If in British Columbia somebody gets flooded, provincial emergency program kicks in and pays up to, I forgot the number, I think it's $300,000 per dwelling. PEP will run out of funds very quickly, and then the federal government is supposed to step in. However, we have done an over-the-thumb analysis of the flood losses. Would there be a 200-year plus flood on Fraser River that would lead to dike breaches and dike overtopping? The number would be quickly somewhere between $60 and $80 billion. So it would take a huge bite out of the Canadian GDP and would cripple the province's industry for some time to come. So we're not talking about trivial amounts of money. And that, of course, fosters the attitude, well, somebody's going to bail us out. Sort of the same attitude that American banks had when the big financial crisis was. Somebody's going to bail us out. Interestingly, it will be when the American government needs to be bailed out. Who's going to do that? Perhaps China. Next one. Well, so all that leads to little incentive for landowners and municipalities to adopt effective regulations on floodplain use. There is really nothing that says thou must. And that's very unlike many of the European Union nations, where it is very, very regulated that if a development is supposed to is supposed to be launched in a floodplain or on a delta, or broadened, or densified, or enlarged. These are the steps that one needs to take. It is very much ingrained in stone, legislative and centralized, how the practitioners need to perform their study, on a checklist, what needs to be done in order to pass it through the various regulatory bodies until it can be permitted. There is a relatively narrow range of flood mitigation measures that is being considered typically, and that has manifold reasons. One of them is still a very classical training that is being done at the universities, where hydrologists get to learn how to do flood frequency analysis with all their facets and caveats. But then the classic hydrologic engineer learns riprapping, learns how to build a dike safely, etc., etc. But there is not really a holistic program in universities that teach that there is various other ways how to address flood risks, for example, by zonation. A good example is, again, perhaps glorifying slightly the European Union nations, but there is this new flood directive right now, and that has prompted many of the European nations to undo the damages that they have done over the past centuries. That means where they have cut off meanders because they wanted to streamline rivers and creeks to make them more efficient in terms of transporting goods and services on those rivers and creeks, to have agricultural reforms where the fields are bigger and squarer, and to reduce, in their mind at the time, flood hazard and flood risk. However, now they have discovered that that is actually a bit of a fallacy, a rather big fallacy indeed. Flood hazard and risk is not reduced by aligning the channel. Quite the opposite, the flood hydrograph gets a lot peakier. Flood hydrograph is the curve as the flood moves downstream, with that axis being time and that axis typically being discharge. It also sterilizes the riverine environment. If you have a river channel that is beautiful and meandering, has pretty riparian vegetation, that's an ecosystem. By aligning it, riprapping it, and slapping a dike right and left on the side of it, you sterilize the riverine environment. You impoverish it not only from a terrestrial habitat point of view, but also the aquatic habitat suffers, etc., etc. So they have realized that on a continental scale, and have started to undo these things. Undoing is costly. It means, in some cases, expropriating land. That's a holy grail in British Columbia, but it does happen. They get reimbursed, compensated. You can't do that with towns or cities, but floodways are created, meanders are being put in, riparian vegetations are planted, oxbow lakes are being created, dikes are set back from the river so that the river has space to do its thing, meaning to do its fluvial geomorphology, its processes. And they put low-intensive developments in the floodplain, such as perhaps a golf course, a soccer field, some gardening. They put beautiful bike paths on top of the setback dikes, and everybody wins. It's really quite interesting to see. That's not just being done on rural areas, but it's being done in cities. If you look at the city of Bern in Switzerland, if you look at downtown Munich, they're ripping out the concrete in their channelizations work, and they're bringing it back to a fully riverine environment. In fact, the Isar River that flows through Munich is now has a bathing water quality from its mouth to its confluence with the Danube River. So all this produces a number of obstacles in reducing future economic losses in Canada and of course in British Columbia as well. If you look at sort of the politics behind flooding in British Columbia, you've seen that there was a flood protection program that came out a couple of years ago. $20 million is slated towards flood risk reduction. Actually, it's flood hazard reduction, and it specifies that it's not for studies, it's meant for construction. As a geoscientist, I like to kind of punch myself when I hear that, because we need the science in order to optimize the type of mitigation that ought to be placed, and that mitigation may not be raising the dikes. Not in this day and age. It may be very, very different. It may be taking the dikes out and setting them back 200 meters. That's expensive. But in lieu of what the potential flood risks could be, that might be the smart thing to do with tax dollars.